The wind howled like a wounded animal over the endless white stretch of Montana territory, swirling up ghost-colored dust and forgotten prayers into the iron-gray sky. A man rode alone across the desolate plain, his horse limping, breath steaming, in the cold. Snow clung to the dying light of the late afternoon, turning everything to ash and bone. This was not a place for the living. It was where men came to disappear. Elijah Kane hadn't spoken in 3 days, not since the fight in Miles City, not since the bottle he'd smashed over a stranger's head bought him one more scar, and not since the knife buried in his shoulder had begun to fester. He didn't much mind the silence. In silence, there was no judgment, just the creak of worn leather, the crunch of hooves through frost-hardened mud, and the ache in his gut that told him he was still alive when he had no business being. He crested a low ridge, and the land dropped into a hollow where a thin line of smoke curled from a cabin chimney. He blinked snow from his lashes. The wound in his shoulder throbbed in rhythm with the horse's gait. Blood had soaked through the flannel and wool, dark and sticky beneath his duster. Another mile, maybe 2, and he'd fall. Whether from the fever or the cold, he couldn't say. Either would do the job just fine. The cabin was nothing more than a single-story squat of timber tucked beneath the flank of a pine-covered hill. A split-rail fence boxed in a small stretch of earth, now buried under snow. Smoke meant life. And life might mean a fire, a roof, or a gun barrel and a warning. Elijah didn't care which. The world tilted as he dismounted, boots slipping in, the slush. He grabbed the saddle horn to steady himself, but his legs buckled and he fell hard on his side. Snow kissed his cheek with indifference. The horse stood still above him, reins dragging, unmoved by its rider's collapse. A door creaked. Footsteps shuffled through the snow. He barely registered the voice. A woman's, sharp, cautious. "You alive?" He didn't answer. Couldn't. Just the sound of breath and the blur of a figure kneeling beside him, her face shadowed by the setting sun behind her. He saw a shotgun slung across her back and eyes like a prairie storm. Gray. Unreadable. Then the world went black. He awoke. To warmth. Not sunlight, but firelight. Crackling. The smell of herbs, wool, and something simmering. He was lying on a straw mattress beneath quilts that weren't his, in a small room with timber walls, a rough-beamed ceiling, and shelves lined with jars. A table sat nearby with a basin, cloth, and a bottle of clear liquor. A kettle hissed. On the stove, his shoulder burned. "You're lucky I found you before the wolves did." The voice came from the other side of the room. The woman stood there, arms crossed, hair pinned in a loose knot, sleeves rolled to the elbows. She looked, maybe 30, 35, hard to tell with frontier women. Life aged them in ways time didn't. She was tall, lean, built like someone who'd had to carry her own burdens and bury her own dead. "You got a name?" she asked. "Elijah," he croaked, the word dragging through his throat like gravel. She nodded once. "Esther Whitlow." They didn't speak for a long time after that. Esther changed the bandage that night without flinching. She worked efficiently, hands steady, even as he bit down on a rag to stifle the pain. She poured something from a small clay jar over the wound, whatever it was, burned like hell, and muttered something low under her breath. Not quite a prayer, not quite a curse. Kane watched her face through half-lidded eyes. She had the look of someone who'd stopped expecting kindness a long time ago. "You were bleeding bad. Fever, too. I almost didn't bring you in," she said, not looking at him. "Why'd you?" She didn't answer until she was done wrapping the fresh cloth around his shoulder. "Couldn't leave you to die in the snow," she said simply. "Didn't seem right." He wanted to laugh, but it hurt too much. Instead, he said, "Ain't many folks still worried about what's right." Her eyes flicked to his. "That a fact?" Silence filled the room like smoke. Days passed. Kane drifted in and out of sleep, fed by warm broth and silence. The fever came and went. Sometimes he woke to find her reading by the fire. Other times she sang softly, Just a line or two, a song with no name. Old and worn like the cabin walls. She never asked questions and he never offered answers. That suited them both fine. One morning he found the strength to stand. He staggered. To the door, opened it. The snow had crusted into ice overnight. The world outside was brittle, silver, untouched. She stood in the yard, splitting wood with clean, practiced swings. Each blow bit deep. She didn't glance his way, didn't slow her rhythm. He watched her for a while before he stepped back inside. Later, she handed him a mug of coffee without a word. It was hot, bitter, and exactly what he needed. He nodded. His thanks. You shoot? She asked. He blinked. Used to. I figured. She didn't press for more. That night the wind came screaming down from the ridgeline. It rattled the shutters and clawed at the corners of the roof like something alive. Kane couldn't sleep. His shoulder throbbed and memory pulled at him. Faces. Blood. A boy no older than 14 with half his head gone from a bullet Kane had fired in a skirmish no one remembered anymore. The war had ended years ago, but the killing hadn't. Not really. He sat by the fire, cradling a cup in both hands. Esther came in from feeding the stove and sat opposite him watching the flames. The shadows carved hard lines into her face, but there was a quiet there too. A steadiness. How long you been out here? He asked. Since Samuel died. He nodded. Your husband? She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, bandits. Winter before last. Thought we had gold hidden somewhere. We didn't. I'm sorry. She shrugged, but the tension in her shoulders gave her away. Sorry. Don't change what is. He nodded again. That he understood. The next morning, wolves came. Kane spotted them first, just shapes in the snow line, watching. There were 4, maybe 5, lean and hungry. Winter had been long, and easy prey was rare. He stepped out onto the porch, the cold slicing into his lungs. Esther was at the barn, unaware. He reached for the rifle resting by the door. Not his. Old, but well kept. He shouldered it, ignoring the pain, and lined up the sight. One wolf crept forward, bold. He fired. It dropped. The others scattered into the trees. Esther came running. You all right? He nodded. They'll come back tonight. She glanced at the trees, then at him. You think you're well enough to shoot again? Don't need to be well, just need to be steady. She said nothing, but something passed between them. Then, something unspoken, quiet as snowfall. That evening he sat out on the porch, rifle across his knees, breath clouding in the cold. She brought him a blanket and left without a word. Later she returned with stew and sat beside him. They shared the silence. The wolves didn't come back. Days passed. The snow began to melt, just a little. Birds returned. Life edged in at the corners. He helped her mend the fence, his shoulders stiff but manageable. She taught him how to check the traps near the tree line. They said little, but every silence between them grew more comfortable, less hollow. One night he asked, You ever think about leaving? She stirred the fire, not looking at him. Where would I go? Someplace warmer, safer. She shook her head. This is my place, my land. Samuel and I built this cabin together, buried him out back. That don't change just because the world got harder. He looked at her then, really looked, saw the strength beneath the stillness. The grief worn like armor. You're tougher than you look, he said. She gave him a tired smile. And you're softer than you act. That night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind whisper through the eaves. For the first time in a long time, he didn't wish for the dark to take him. Something had shifted. Not quite salvation, but maybe the beginning of it. Snow thawed slow that spring, as though the land itself was hesitant to trust warmth again. The days stretched longer, though a chill still clung to the mornings like breath on glass. In the hollow beneath the pine-covered hill, life resumed, in measured steps. Elijah Kane, once a ghost riding toward death, now rose with the sun to stack wood, patch fences, and work the earth he'd never meant to survive long enough to touch again. Esther watched him from the porch, her needle pausing, mid-stitch. He moved stiffly, favoring his left shoulder, but there was precision in his work. He wasn't built for peace. His posture, his eyes, the way he flinched at sudden noises, they all whispered of a life lived under the weight of gunpowder and regret. But something had softened in him. Just barely, like ice cracking under early light. They didn't speak much. Conversation, when it came, was practical. Yet there was understanding in the way she passed him a tool before he asked for it, in the way he brewed coffee, the way she liked it without needing to be told. What once had been silence edged with suspicion had become something else entirely. An ease, not comfort, not yet, but something honest. One morning, Kane stood at the window, staring across the field. The fence line curved toward the woods, where tree shadows pooled like smoke. He narrowed his eyes. "Something's moved out there," he said. Esther didn't look up from her skillet. "Elk? No elk tracks are that wide. Or careful." He stepped outside. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and ash. He knelt at the edge of the porch, brushing frost from a shallow print. The snow was disturbed in a single line, nearly invisible unless you were trained to see the world in signs and absence. Whatever it was had circled the cabin without getting close. Kane followed the trail a few yards before it disappeared among the trees. That night, he sat awake near the window, rifle balanced across his knees. Esther joined him without a word, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. They shared the silence, listening to the distant call of owls and the whisper of wind in the trees. "He's not coming to steal," Kane said quietly. "He's watching." Esther didn't ask how he knew. She trusted his instincts more than she liked to admit. The next morning, a bundle of dried sage, wild onions, and crushed pine resin lay on the doorstep, bound with a strip of leather. Kane stared at it a long time before picking it up. "Someone left this?" Esther asked. "Someone's been watching, close enough to know what my shoulder still needs." "You think it's a trap?" "No. This is a gift." She didn't press. Instead, she took the herbs and laid them in a pot to boil. The air filled with sharp, earthy steam. That night, Kane slept more soundly. Days passed. The watcher remained unseen but ever present. Kane caught flashes now and then, just movement through the trees, too smooth for a deer, too quiet for a bear. Tracks confirmed it. Someone walked those woods barefoot even in lingering snow. One afternoon, Kane found a second bundle near the stream. A rabbit, skinned and cleaned, hung neatly from a tree branch. He took it back to the cabin and laid it on the table. Esther raised an eyebrow. "That from our traps?" "No. Left for us." She stared at the rabbit a moment, then nodded and fetched the pot. Later, as the stew simmered, Kane stepped out into the dusk and called softly into the trees. "Thank you." No answer came, but something stirred in the branches, distant and approving. That night, sleep found him easily, but with sleep came memory. He was 20 again, kneeling in the mud of Shiloh, rifle propped on a fallen log, heart thundering in his ears. Smoke burned his eyes. A boy, barely a boy really, ran toward him with a bayonet fixed. Elijah had fired before he realized the kid's uniform was threadbare, patched, probably looted. The boy crumpled mid-stride, mouth opening in surprise. Kane rushed over. He remembered that. Maybe to check, maybe to finish the job. But the moment lingered like a scar. The boy hadn't been a soldier, just hungry, and Elijah had stopped seeing faces by then. That realization stayed with him, embedded deeper than any bullet. He woke before dawn, cold sweat clinging to his back. Outside, he saw footprints. Not animal, not heavy enough for boots. Human, barefoot, again. They circled the cabin, pausing, at each window but never touching. just watching. Kane followed them deeper into the woods than before, moving carefully, rifle slung but not raised. The tracks led to a clearing where stones had been stacked into a rough circle, a fire pit long dead. Beside it stood a man. He was tall, lean as a whip, wrapped in furs and weather-worn leather. His hair was long, braided with beads and feathers, and his face held no expression at all. His skin was dark bronze, his eyes unreadable. Kane said nothing at first. The man didn't flinch, didn't speak. Eventually, Kane raised one hand in quiet acknowledgement. The man mirrored the gesture. "My name's Elijah," he said. Still nothing. "You've been watching." A nod. Barely perceptible. "Why?" The man turned and pointed toward the ridge above Esther's cabin. Kane followed the direction, noting the clear vantage point it offered. Perfect for watching over the land. A protector's perch. "You were watching her." No answer, but something in the man's eyes shifted. "Thank you for the herbs. And the rabbit." A pause, then a single word. Heavy with accent but deliberate. "Toka." Kane nodded. "You're not here to harm her." Toka said nothing. He didn't need to. Kane turned to leave, then paused. "If you're staying close, I'd rather we work together than circle each other like wolves." Toka didn't respond. But the next day, Kane found the traps already checked and reset. The rhythms of life grew more layered. Kane repaired the barn door. Esther cooked meals that smelled of cedar and root. Toka, unseen, left sign each morning that he'd walked the perimeter, strips of bark peeled clean, rocks realigned near the stream. Each subtle, intentional, trust formed not through words, but action. It settled into the cabin like dust, unnoticed at first until it was simply part of the air they breathed. One morning, Esther handed Kane a bundle of cloth. "Found this in the chest. Used to be Samuel's. Might fit you better." Inside were worn but sturdy clothes, homespun shirt, wool trousers, a thick coat. Kane hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you. You'll work better if you're not freezing half to death." He changed without comment. The clothes fit well, surprisingly so. Esther gave him a quick glance when he emerged, then returned to stirring the pot. That night they heard a howl in the distance. Not wolves. Human. Kane tensed. Esther's eyes narrowed. That was too close. He stepped outside, scanning the dark horizon. In the moonlight he saw smoke, thin, rising on the ridge westward. A campfire, maybe two. Someone's moving through. Trappers? He shook his head. Too loud. Wrong time of year. Might be the ones that took Samuel. Esther's face hardened. She said nothing more, but Kane noticed her fingers curl around the edge of the table like she was holding herself steady. The next morning, he rode to the ridge, rifle slung. Toka joined him without a word, emerging from the woods, like a breath of mist. They moved together, silent, efficient. The trail was fresh, boot prints heavy, dragging. 4 men, maybe 5. Armed. They found a broken cartwheel, discarded whiskey bottles, a torn glove. Kane held it up. Blood stained the cuff. "Not just passing through," he said. "Looking for something." Toka scanned the trees, then crouched, pointing at the markings carved into a birch. A symbol, a crude snake, coiled. Kane's jaw tightened. He'd seen that mark before. Branded on saddlebags, carved into saloon tables. A gang called the Gallo Brothers. Deserters turned bandits. Too wild for even the outlaws. Last he'd heard, they'd torched a wagon train and left the survivors to freeze. "They'll come at night," Kane said. "They always do." Toka met his eyes. No fear there. Just readiness. They returned to the cabin. Esther had already fetched her rifle. Kane nodded in approval. "If they find us, it won't be for conversation." "I'm not afraid," she said. He believed her. That night, Kane couldn't sleep. He stood by the window again, rifle in hand. Esther sat near the fire, polishing bullets with a rag. "We have a chance now," he said. "We weren't meant to, but we do." She met his gaze. "Then we protect it. He didn't smile, but he felt something stir in his chest. A purpose he hadn't known he missed. Outside, the wind shifted. Snow began to fall once more, soft as ash. They waited. The snowfall thickened, blanketing the earth in silence as if nature itself held its breath. The air was tense, tight as a drawn bowstring. Elijah Kane paced the perimeter of the cabin, boots crunching in the crusted snow. His rifle never left his side. Every sound, wind shifting through branches, the creak of the barn door, snapped his head around. The Gallo brothers weren't ghosts. They were men, flesh and blood, but Kane had seen what they left behind. They took without mercy and killed, without pause. Toka had vanished into the trees just after dawn, tracking. He'd said nothing. He never did unless necessary, but Kane had learned to read the man's silences like scripture. Esther stayed close to the hearth that day, but she wasn't idle. Her movements were precise, oiling the rifle, sorting ammunition, cutting cloth into makeshift bandages. She had the focused look of someone preparing for the worst because she'd lived through worse before. "I've only ever killed once," she said without looking up. Kane paused near the window. "That right?" She nodded, folding gauze. "He was the last one through the door. Didn't see me behind the stove. Samuel was already gone. It was just instinct." He said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "Instincts kept more people alive than prayer ever did." She finally looked at him. "And which one keeps you alive?" Kane's jaw tightened. "Regret." The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. It had depth. Truth had a way of sharpening things. By dusk, Toka returned. His face was grim, his body streaked with cold sweat and sap. He stepped into the cabin and dropped a bloodied piece of cloth on the table, a patch bearing the same coiled snake insignia Kane had seen carved into the birch. "They're close," Kane said, voice low. Toka nodded. Then he unrolled a crude map he'd drawn into the dirt on a wooden plank. 5 marks. Close. Too close. "They've split up," Kane muttered, tracing one of the etched lines with his fingertip. "Trying to come around from the north, south, and west. They think this place is an easy take." Esther stood, calm despite the rising storm in the room. "Then we make it hard." They spent the night preparing. Kane and Toka set snares just beyond the tree line, tripwires strung through brush, old tins tied with twine to rattle at the slightest movement. Kane dug 2 shallow foxholes near the barn and lined them with sharp stakes. Toka buried traps along the stream where the snow had started to melt, concealing them under pine needles and moss. Esther placed oil lanterns along the cabin's perimeter, far enough to draw eyes, close enough to backlight anyone who approached. Then she stashed extra ammunition by each window, like she'd done this before. Maybe not in war, but in the aftermath of one. As they worked, the wind screamed through the pines, carrying with it the scent of blood and powder yet spilled. The finality of the coming fight settled deep in Kane's bones. He felt it not just as a threat, but as a reckoning. Just before midnight, the first warning bell rang. A tin can rattled to the west, sharp and jarring in the stillness. Kane and Toka took position at the cabin's corner, eyes narrowed, breaths even. They waited. Seconds stretched. Then came the faint crunch of snow beneath boots, deliberate, slow, trying too hard to be quiet. Toka nodded once and disappeared around the rear. Kane saw the first shape emerge from the trees, a thick man, in a tattered coat, shotgun cradled in his arms. His face was obscured by a scarf, but Kane didn't need to see his eyes to know the look. Predator. The rifle bucked against Kane's shoulder. The man fell mid-step, dead before he hit the snow. Another rattle, this time behind the barn. A shout. Then silence. Toka returned minutes later, blood streaked across his knife, breathing steady. "They'll come harder now," Kane said. And they did. From the south, 2 men broke through the fence line, firing wildly. Bullets splintered wood and shattered a lantern. Kane ducked behind the corner, returned fire with measured precision. One fell, screaming. The other darted behind the water trough. Esther, from inside the cabin, took a shot through the window. Glass shattered. The man behind the trough slumped forward, lifeless. The firefight didn't last long, but it rang like thunder through the valley. When silence returned, it felt unnatural, anticipatory. "They're testing us," Kane muttered. "Seeing how we fight. They'll wait for dawn." And they did. The next morning was red with sunrise and blood. The final 2 men came down from the ridge. They were smarter, more coordinated. One fired from a distance, pinning Kane behind the tool shed. The other tried to flank the cabin, but Toka was waiting, bow drawn. The arrow struck with a heavy thunk, and the man collapsed, twitching. The last one, bigger, meaner, with eyes like frostbite, charged the front door. Kane moved fast, too fast for the pain in his healing shoulder, and met him head-on. They clashed just beyond the porch, fists and fury. The man swung a knife, caught Kane in the ribs. Kane grunted, twisted, slammed the butt of his rifle into the man's jaw. Bone cracked. They tumbled into the snow, grappling. Kane's breath came in gasps, vision blurred. Then the cold steel of the knife pressed against his neck, and just as the blade began to bite, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed through the clearing. The man froze, then slumped, blood pouring from the side of his head. Kane looked up. Esther stood in the doorway, rifle smoking. Her hands didn't tremble. Kane coughed, laughed once, wincing. "Told you you had good instincts." She didn't smile, just stepped forward and helped him to his feet. By noon, the bodies were buried beyond the ridge. No words were said over them. They didn't deserve any, just cold earth and forgetting. Kane sat on the cabin steps afterward, shirt unbuttoned, the wound at his ribs wrapped tight. Esther brought a flask, whiskey, bitter and sharp. They passed it between them without ceremony. "You could leave now," she said softly. "No reason to stay anymore." He didn't look at her. "Plenty of reasons to stay, just none I understand yet." She glanced toward the tree line. "What about him?" Toka stood at a distance, leaning against a tree, arms folded. Watching, always watching. "He'll move on eventually," Kane said. "He's not made for fences." "Are you?" Kane didn't answer. That night, for the first time since he'd arrived, he didn't dream of war. Or blood. He dreamed of Esther humming by the fire, of Toka's silent steps in the snow, of birds returning in spring. He woke with the feeling of something unfinished. Not broken. Just paused. Later that morning, Toka approached the cabin. He didn't speak but offered Kane a single arrow, black-feathered, its head shaped like a fang. A symbol. Of what? Kane wasn't sure. Trust, maybe. Debt repaid. Brotherhood. He took it. Then Toka vanished into the trees without a word. Esther stood beside Kane, watching the spot where the warrior disappeared. "Will he come back?" "If we need him," Kane said. She didn't press for more. The valley felt different now. Not safe. It would never be safe. But it was held, claimed by those willing to fight for it. And Kane had fought. Not for glory. Not for blood, but for something simpler, something quieter, a place, a person, a promise. The snow continued to melt. Earth appeared beneath it, dark and damp and waiting. Kane helped Esther plant seeds that week. Potatoes, onions, early corn. They worked side by side, dirt under their nails, sweat on their brows. It was not redemption, but it was effort, and effort meant hope. As the days warmed, birds returned. The world, it seemed, was willing to begin again, and so was he. The river ran faster now. Spring had taken full hold of the land, and snowmelt roared down the slopes like something trying to forget winter. Green threaded through the valleys in cautious strands, and birdsong returned to the trees, tentative, but persistent. Inside the cabin, life settled into a rhythm. Not peace, Elijah Kane would never call it that, but something like stillness. He mended what was broken, fixed what was worn, and took up the small, honest labor that had eluded him for most of his life. Esther watched him change, quietly, the way she had watched the seasons turn. Not all at once, but day by day. He spoke, more, in words weighed before being given. His hands were still calloused, still quick to reach for his rifle when startled, but now they were also steady with a hoe, or careful with the sprout of a potato shoot. The nightmares hadn't left entirely, but he woke from them less often, and when he did, he sometimes let her stay near until his breathing slowed. One night, as they sat on the porch beneath a sky awash with stars, Esther broke the silence. "Why did you come west?" Kane stared ahead, jaw flexing. He rolled a toothpick between his lips before answering. "Because there was nothing left behind me." "War took it all?" "No. I gave it up long before the war did." She said nothing, giving him space to continue if he chose. "He did. My wife died before the war ended. Fever. Our son was conscripted at 16 and didn't come back. After that, there wasn't anything left of me but the gun and the road." Esther's voice was soft. "And now?" Kane took a long breath. "Now there's a garden, a roof, and someone who doesn't look at me like I'm already a ghost." She looked at him then, not with pity, but with quiet understanding. But peace never held long in a world still bleeding from its wounds. It was near sundown when the riders came. 4 of them, strangers, mean-looking men on tired horses, dust-covered and worn, but with eyes sharp as razors. Esther saw them first, out near, the creek watching from the ridge above. She stepped inside, her face pale. "Elijah, there's men on the rise." He was at the door in seconds, rifle in hand. One glance confirmed what he already knew in his gut. Trouble had found them again. The men didn't ride closer, not at first. They watched like wolves circling, assessing. Then one broke from the group, riding down alone. He stopped 10 yards from the porch, tipping his hat in mock politeness. He had a long scar down one cheek and the unmistakable posture of someone who'd killed more than once and planned to do it again. "Evenin'," he said, smiling with teeth that gleamed too white. "Name's Rowdy Finch. I believe you're harboring something belongs to me." Kane stood silent, body still but ready. "You lost a shovel, I'll lend you one. But if you mean trouble, you're already late for that." Rowdy chuckled. "Fair enough. See, my boys and I, we're looking for someone. Feller named Toka, Indian fella. Scar across his chest, walks like a shadow. Heard tell he's been seen around here?" Kane's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "He's not here now." "That's a shame," Rowdy said, dismounting slowly, hand never far from his revolver. "See, we got business with him. Nasty sort of business, and I get ornery when people lie to me." Esther stepped beside Kane, holding her own rifle at her hip. "We don't lie," she said. "But we don't invite devils to supper either." Rowdy's grin soured. He backed up slowly, climbed into his saddle, and spat into the dirt. "You best mind your doors tonight, storm's coming." "You'll see." He turned and rode back to the ridge. Kane watched them vanish over the hill, his mind already racing. He knew the type. Hired killers, or worse. Opportunists who wrapped cruelty in reason. If they were looking for Toka, they wouldn't stop. And if they thought Toka had left something behind, they'd come back with fire. That night, Kane sat long by the hearth, staring at the flames. Esther sat nearby, knitting, but not really looking at her hands. "They'll be back," she said. Kane nodded. "At night, like always. Do we run?" "No." He looked toward the woods. "We don't have to." At dawn, Kane went searching. He didn't call out. He didn't leave signs. He just walked into the trees, quiet and slow, following instinct and a sense of being watched. And after an hour, Toka appeared. "You knew they were coming," Kane said. Toka gave a slight nod. "They want you." Another nod. "You could leave. Save us the trouble." Toka looked Kane in the eye. "I stay." That was all. The sun set on a quiet afternoon and the world braced again. When night fell, Rowdy Finch returned, this time with all 3 of his men and fire in their hands. They approached the cabin, from 3 sides, torches glowing like malevolent stars. "You had your chance," Rowdy shouted, his voice cutting through the night. "Give us the savage, and we'll walk away." From the darkness, Toka's arrow flew true and silent. One of the men dropped, torch flying from his hand. Gunfire exploded. Kane fired from the cabin's front window, dropping another rider mid-charge. Toka moved like a phantom, loosing arrows, vanishing before gunfire could trace him. Rowdy cursed, ducking behind the barn, firing wildly. Esther, calm as ever, loaded and shot from the porch, forcing Rowdy's last man to scatter. And then Rowdy made his mistake. He thought he could outflank them. He circled behind, crouched low, and slipped through the back door of the cabin, revolver raised. Inside, he found only silence, and then Kane stepped from the shadows. They fought hard. Rowdy lunged, wild and fast, slashing with his knife. Kane caught the blade with his forearm, blood running hot. He slammed the butt of his rifle into Rowdy's face. They grappled, cursed, slammed into furniture. The table broke beneath their weight. Rowdy climbed atop him, knife pressing against Kane's throat. "You ain't no hero," he hissed. "Just another killer in a new coat." Kane's hand slipped beneath the stove, finding what he'd placed there earlier. A hidden blade. He drove it upward, straight into Rowdy's ribs. The man gasped, eyes wide, then fell limp. Outside, the last of the fire died. Toka stood over the final body, blood on his tunic, but his eyes still sharp. The fight was over. At dawn, the ridge was quiet again. They buried the dead without words. Toka helped Kane bind his wound, the two men sitting side by side as light filtered through the trees. Esther approached, her hands wrapped in a shawl, face worn with worry and resolve. "You stayed," she said to Toka. He nodded. "Debt owed." Kane looked between them. "Debts paid." Toka glanced at the hills, then back to Kane. "Not yet." And with that, he turned and walked into the forest again. Kane watched him go, then looked at the place they'd defended, the cabin, the broken door, the ash near the fence. All of it held meaning now. It had been forged in fear, but it stood in something stronger. Esther reached out, touched his arm. "You could leave now," she said again. Kane looked at her, then at the rising sun. "No," he said. "I've already left too much behind." He picked up the hammer and began to rebuild the door. The past had sent its final ghost, and he'd buried it. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was staying.